All right, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to week 3 for PPA 500. We are a little bit after 4 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. And I'm sure some more people will be joining us along the way, but I hope everyone is having a good week so far. This course, as I warned you on our first night together, this course goes by very quickly, and we're already in week 3. So after next week, we'll be at the official halfway point of the course. So one thing to keep in mind is that the midterm assessment is a few weeks away, and I did promise you that I would go ahead and open up the midterm assessment 2 weeks before it is due. So that means next week I will go ahead and open it up for you. So I'll open it up next Wednesday, and that will then give you 2 weeks then to work on that midterm assessment. I know it sounds weird to talk about midterm assessment already, but that's how quickly this class tends to proceed. Thank you very much for your initial skill self-assessments. I went through and I reviewed all of those and awarded the 5 out of 5 points. And so thank you for the good, clear, honest assessments. Again, what we're going to do with those is that then when you get to 697 at the end of your program, you'll do a final skill self-assessment. And then both of those, the initial and the final, will go into part 1 of your student learning portfolio. And then what we do as a faculty is we'll then take every spring semester, we will take a random sample of portfolios, and we'll go back through and compare the scores from the initial to the final skill self-assessment, again, purely as an assessment type of mechanism for our accreditation. So also thank you for your Canvas essay number 1. I went through and reviewed all of those essays along with the responses to classmates. I was impressed. I think everyone did a really nice job. The essays were insightful. They demonstrated a good, strong, clear reading of the Madison article of Federalist Paper number 10. And one of the challenges we sometimes have when we have a post that is being responded to by everyone is sometimes there's some duplication, but I didn't see much of that this time. I think everyone did a nice job of posting an original essay and give me an original, insightful analysis of factions and whether or not we were factionalized today more so than in the past and what we can do to try and control the effects of factions. So I appreciate that. The work that you did, the way in which you did your Canvas essay number 1 was perfect. So just keep doing that same type of approach for our next 4 Canvas essays and everyone will be in good shape. So thank you for those. And what you have coming up next then is next week you have another Canvas essay number 2. And Canvas essay number 2 looks at accountability and ethics. And I don't think we're going to have time tonight to get through all of accountability and ethics. But at the very least tonight, near the end of class, I will make sure that we can carve out time to at least look at the American Society for Public Administration Code of Ethics and go through those 8 principles in the ASPA Code of Ethics, because that will then form the basis for what you'll be doing for Canvas essay number 2. In Canvas essay number 2, which is due next week, what you'll be doing is you will be reviewing those 8 principles in the ASPA Code of Ethics, then selecting 3 of those 8 principles that you think could be difficult either for you to implement as an individual or could be difficult for your organization to implement, and talk about why those 3 principles may be difficult to implement. But again, I'll introduce you to those 8 principles tonight. I also then have a link on our Canvas site that will take you directly to the ASPA Code of Ethics, so you can go and read through those 8 principles on your own in preparation for Canvas essay number 2. And then as always, in addition to your initial post, then you'll also be giving me responses to 2 of your classmates. So that's what's coming up due next week. And so we'll, again, at least foreshadow some of the information that you need to do that Canvas essay for next week. I know last week we ran long, and I apologize for that, but the first half of class, the library tutorial, took a little bit longer than I anticipated, but that's fine because that's good, important information that you're going to need throughout the entire program. So we didn't have as much time as I thought we would have to go through our entire discussion of the foundations of American government. So what I have on the agenda tonight is to pick our discussion up with where we left it last week, finish up our discussion of the foundational aspects of American government, then spend some time going through the US Constitution and talking about the different elements of the Constitution. We'll go through the 7 articles and the 27 amendments. and talk about how we as public administrators need to be familiar with the Constitution and endeavor not to violate the constitutional rights of people that we come into contact with. Once we get all that work done, then we'll turn our attention to accountability and ethics. We'll see how much time we have left, but at the very least, we'll at least introduce the 8 principles in the ASPA Code of Ethics. And then if necessary, we can finish up all the rest of our accountability and ethics information at the beginning of class next week. Then next week, we're going to get into the differences between public and private administration. And we'll talk about why it's unique to study public administration and why we study public administration somewhat differently than we study business administration, and really give a good foundation for why we have a field of public administration and why we have a master's of public administration degree instead of just having an MBA, a master's of business administration. So we'll get to all that next week. So that's our agenda. That's where we're at. Are there any questions or anything before we get going for the evening? Okay. All right, well, let's just jump into where we left off last week. And last week, in our discussion of the foundations of American government, we talked about our system of government, our democratic republic, as being oriented around the limitation of power. So we have this Constitution, we have this social contract, and the social contract limits the power of government. And we said we limited power in 2 main ways. We limited power horizontally with separation of powers, executive, legislative, and judicial. And then we also divided a power and limited power vertically through our system of American federalism. Now, I think we're all very familiar with, the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. We're very familiar with that concept of separation of powers, that horizontal division of power. I think what we're probably less familiar with is the vertical separation of power known as American federalism. So we're going to spend a little bit of time tonight talking about American federalism and talking about the development of American federalism and how it's a dynamic concept. And our system of federalism today does look much different than the system of federalism that the framers devised back in the late 1700s. But whether we're talking the horizontal division of power through separation of powers or the vertical division of power through American federalism, we're still talking about this core issue of power. We're dividing up and we're trying to limit the power of government and limit the power of governmental actors, which then begs the question of, well, what is power? Would we be best served if we took a few minutes and talk about the term power and come up with an agreed upon definition of the term power? So let me ask you, give me a definition of the word power. What does power mean to you? You can use your microphone, you can use text chat, whatever you're comfortable with, but what is power?
To me, power is having some sense of or level of authority over others.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's a very important element of power. You have some authority over others, authority to utilize resources, over others. And that authority that we have over others, that utilization of those resources, that's usually done for a reason. And as Jill says in the text chat, having the means to move or control something or someone. And I think that's what we use the authority for. That's what we use the resources for, is to influence someone to do something. So whenever you're using resources or you're using your basis of authority, your position of authority, to influence someone to do something they otherwise would not do, I think that's probably when we are exercising this term known as power. So power is the ability to use resources to influence someone to do something they otherwise would not do. I think that's a really good basic definition of power. And I think in most political science courses, that's kind of the definition of power that most, I think most instructors would deal with. What I like to do in this class is to take that definition, which I think is a very good definition, but add a little bit of nuance to it. And I really want to introduce you to an author by the name of John Gaventa. And I'll put some of this in text chat for you, but John, talk and type at the same time. John Gaventa. And John Gaventa did a very famous study in the field of political science, and it resulted in a book called Power and Powerlessness in Appalachia. And what he did is he wanted to do a case study to look at power and the differences in power and how some people and some entities exert power, sometimes complete and total power over others. And he was really interested in this disparity in power between people and between groups. So he thought one of the best ways to study that is to find a region where there are great disparities in power. And so he focused on a place in rural Appalachia, and he went to Claiborne, Kentucky, I'm sorry, Claiborne, Tennessee, Claiborne County, Tennessee, and Bell County, Kentucky. And if you know anything about that region of the country, Claiborne County, Tennessee is actually one county away from where my family is from. And it's a lot of coal mines. There's a lot of coal mining in the hills going on there. And so what he wanted to do is go into coal mine towns and ask the question, how do these coal mine owners exert so much power over coal miners? How do they get these coal miners to do things that they otherwise would not do, that would not necessarily be in their own rational self-interest? You know, we normally like to think from an economic perspective that people will do things that make rational self-interest for them, that will expand their rational self-interest. And so if you're a rational self-interested actor, you are going to take a course of action, you're going to behave in a way in which you can maximize your benefits while minimizing your costs. But what he saw is these coal miners, they were taking the opposite actions. They were engaging in the opposite behaviors. They were engaged in behaviors that actually cost them more than they would benefit. And some examples is that working in these coal mines, they were working 70, 80-hour weeks. So very long weeks in the coal mines. The coal mines were very dangerous types of places as well. If you know anything about coal mining, coal mines have this nasty propensity for exploding. That whenever you're working in the coal mine, it releases gases. Whenever you have the gases released in the coal mine, any type of spark, any type of ignition could very well cause an explosion and then a collapse of the mine. And it happened frequently, and a lot of people died doing that type of work. There's a way in which the coal mine owners could reduce the risk of explosion. And it's a process known as dusting in the mine business. And so when you dust the mine, you literally tamp down the gases with dust. And by doing that, the gases then are not in the atmosphere, so that if there is a spark, and oftentimes you do have a spark whenever you are trying to break through rock with metal on rock, oftentimes that creates a spark. Even if a spark is created, if the gases have been tamped down through mine dusting, you have less likelihood for an explosion. And everyone knows that dusting a mine greatly reduces the risk of explosion by an exponential number. However, dusting the mine would cost the coal mine owners money. And so they were putting off the dusting of the mine. The coal miners knew that the mines were not being dusted. They knew that it was a more dangerous situation because they weren't being dusted, but they continued to work in those mines, doing something that looked like it was opposite of their rational self-interest. Another example is that in some of these towns, the coal miners got paid with tokens. So you work in the mine all day, and then instead of getting cash for your work, you end up getting a token. Those tokens could then only be redeemed in the one grocery store in town, which was owned by the company. Now you always hear that, I owe my soul to the company store. Well, that's the company store. It's owned by the coal mine owners, and that's the only place where you can spend these tokens. So basically, the coal mine owners were getting all these tokens back by making the coal miners shop in their own company store. So all these things that the coal miners were doing really seemed to be counterintuitive to their rational self-interest. And so Gaventa wanted to know, why are they doing that? How do the coal mine owners get these coal miners to do these things that are against their own rational self-interest? And building upon some existing theories, what Gaventa ended up identifying is he ended up identifying three faces or three different types of power. The first type of power is a very visible type of power. I like to call it overt power. Now, Gaventa didn't use the term overt. He referred to it as visible power, but it's kind of an overt, obvious type of power. It's very visible. Both parties know that power is being exercised. Both parties know that one party is influencing another party to do something they otherwise would not do. And so if you think about, I always used to use the example when we were on campus in the SPA building, that if you get your score back on an assignment and you don't like the score you got, you come up behind me and you push me out the window. By pushing me out the window, it's visible. You're pushing me out the window. You know what you're doing. If I see you coming, I know you're the one who pushed me out the window. And so we both know that power is being exercised. It's a very visible type of power. That type of visible overt power, Gaventa argues, is the least dangerous type of power. Unless you're the one getting pushed out the window, it's the least dangerous type of power because both parties know what is going on. There's nothing hidden here. It's not invisible. The second type of power is a more hidden type of power. And that type of power is what we refer to as a mobilization of bias. And by mobilization of bias in the second type of power, he's referring to agenda setting, the ability to set the agenda. And as you go on into more courses in the program, you'll come upon PPA 670 policy analysis. And you'll spend a lot of time in policy analysis talking about different models of agenda setting. Because before a policy can ever be written and adopted by a decision-making body, that issue must first get on their formal decision-making agenda. If the issue never gets on the formal decision-making agenda of a decision-making body, no decisions will ever be made, no policy will ever be written or passed. That's what was going on here in these coal mine towns, in that the coal mine workers knew that they were working in dangerous conditions. They knew they're working long hours in the mines. They knew they're getting paid with tokens. But they didn't know why there was no mine regulation legislation making its way through the Tennessee state legislature or through the Kentucky state legislature. They didn't understand why the state legislature was not passing laws to protect them. But the state legislature wasn't passing laws to protect them because the issue was being kept from the agenda by the coal mine owners through their contributions to candidates, through their support for candidates when they run for state legislative office. Those candidates would then become beholden to the coal mine owners and would then do the coal mine owners' bidding by keeping those issues off of the formal decision-making agenda. That's a more dangerous type of power, according to Gaventa, with agenda setting, because one party doesn't know that a power is being exercised. The coal mine workers, all they knew is no legislation was being passed to protect them, but they didn't know why. They didn't know it was the coal mine owners who were getting that done. So that becomes a more hidden type of power, which becomes much more dangerous. But by far the most dangerous type of power is what Gaventa referred to as the invisible power. And I like to use the term co-optation for this invisible type of power. With invisible power, with co-optation, what was happening is that the coal mine owners were making the coal mine workers believe that what was going on was actually in their best interest. So working 80-hour weeks in the mine is really in your best interest as a worker. Getting paid in tokens is in your best interest as a worker. Working in an unsafe mine condition enhances the profits of the company, which is in your best interest as a coal mine worker. So they were able to co-opt the opinions. They were able to take the opinions of the coal mine owners and make those the opinions of the coal mine workers, to supplant the actual rational self-interest of those coal mine workers. They were able to co-opt their opinions. Again, that's the most dangerous type of power because it is invisible. The coal mine workers didn't know what was happening. They didn't know that this was not their best interest. They thought that what was in the company's best interest was in their personal self-interest as well. So these three faces of power, the visible, the hidden, and the invisible, the overt, the mobilization of bias or agenda setting, and co-optation, The importance of this discussion is that it lets us know that power is really a very nuanced, multifaceted type of term. That oftentimes we just say, this organization has power over this organization, or this person has power over this person, but not all types of power are created equally. And the more invisible the power, the more dangerous that type of power becomes. So I really like Gaventa's study, and I really like it here within the context of what we are talking about, because it does give us that more nuanced look at this term of power. And really everything we've discussed up to this point in time has been about power, limiting power, dividing up power. That's what our system of government is all about. So I would say just hang on to this Gaventa typology of the three different faces of power, because as we move through the course in future sessions, we're going to talk about examples of different types of power that are exercised not only in American government, but also in public administration. And so I think that this typology will be useful for us as we move forward. So again, just kind of a more nuanced, sophisticated definition of what power is. But again, when we limit power in our system of government, as we said, we do it horizontally through separation of powers, but we also do it vertically through our system of American federalism. So I would like to spend a few minutes talking about federalism, what federalism is, how federalism has changed over the past 200 plus years. If you find any of this discussion about federalism interesting, we do have a class. It's called Intergovernmental Relations, PPA 535. We offer it once per year. It's offered in the first summer session. It's a 6-week online asynchronous course. So if any of this information is interesting to you, feel free to consider that as one of the electives that you might take for the program. It does tend to fill up relatively quickly, but that's a summer session 1 course called Intergovernmental Relations. But let's talk a bit about federalism, what it is, and how it's developed over the past 200 years. So again, we said federalism is the division of authority, the division of power and duties and responsibilities between national and state governments. When we are only talking about the division of power between national and state governments, we are talking about a term known as constitutional federalism. It's called constitutional federalism because the US Constitution only discusses those two levels of government, national government and state governments. There is no mention, there are no provisions for local governments in the national constitution. So when you say constitutional federalism, we're talking national and state powers, duties, and responsibilities. When we start to add local governments into the equation, we move from the term constitutional federalism to the term intergovernmental relations. And the reason why we in this program call our class intergovernmental relations is because we do focus on local governments. We focus on all three levels of government. When I was in my graduate program, when I took the course is called federalism, because the focus was really very much on the Constitution and what the Constitution says about the relationship between national and state governments. But today, we're really more in the world of intergovernmental relations because of the rise of local government. But let's talk about how these relationships have changed over time over the past 200 years. And as we talk about these different eras of federalism, to go through the development of federalism, you'll notice I have an inset box here in our slides showing you 3 different models of federalism, 3 different models of how the relationship between the different levels of government can look. So let me move a couple things out of the way here. And text jets blowing up on me. Here we go. So at the founding of the country, we know that we had this conflict at the Constitutional Convention between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists, led by Madison, believed in a stronger national government and getting rid of the Articles of Confederation and replacing it with a brand new constitution and a stronger national government. The other faction was the Anti-Federalists, led by Sherman. They believed in state sovereignty and states' rights and say they wanted most of the duties and most of the functions to remain with the states. So when the Constitution was ratified, and from the late 1700s up until the beginning of the Civil War, we were in an era of federalism that a lot of scholars like to call dual federalism, in that we had the national government and we had state governments and never the two shall meet. You'll see in that inset box here, we have our little somewhat Venn diagrams, but we have one circle for state, and we have one circle for the national government. And of course, local governments are then subsumed within the state. But those two spheres of influence, the state sphere of influence, the national sphere of influence, were separate from each other. So the state governments, they had their duties and responsibilities, and the national government had its duties and responsibilities. During the era of dual federalism, if you were going to draw this diagram, the way in which it would look under dual federalism, the state sphere of influence would actually be larger. The circle for state would be larger than the circle for national, because the state governments were more responsible for more duties than what we saw with this new national government. But they were separate and distinct, a line of demarcation between their two spheres of influence. Now, the local circle falls completely within the state circle because local governments are considered to be creatures of the state. And there was a judge in the 1800s in Iowa named John Dillon, and he promulgated this thing known as Dillon's Rule. Well, it should just be rule, Dillon's Rule. And Dillon's Rule says just that local governments are creatures of the state. They're creatures of the state because local governments do not have any standing in the US Constitution. The only protections, constitutional protections that local governments have, come directly from the state constitution and from state laws. So the protections they have come from the protections given to them by the state, not the national constitution. And so because of this Dillon's Rule, that local governments are creatures of the state, that's why the local circle is completely subsumed within the state circle. Now, that's an important concept, because if local governments are creatures of the state, if they are created by the state, they can then be empowered by the state. And then the logical extension is they can then be destroyed by the state, and the state can then take them out of existence. And that may sound like a pretty extreme type of option, but it has happened. And just very recently in the California state legislature, there have been discussions about removing the incorporation status for cities such as Vernon. If you're familiar with Vernon, Vernon's a very commercial, industrial city, not a whole lot of residents living in Vernon. And so there's been discussion about unincorporating Vernon and making it part of unincorporated Los Angeles County instead of being its own city. We've heard similar types of discussions in the state legislature about doing something similar to other cities like in Yurupa Valley, for instance. One of the graduates of our program was a longtime city manager for Yurupa Valley. And during his time as a city manager, those discussions were going on in Sacramento. So states can do that. They can take away the incorporation status of a city and make it unincorporated. So local governments are the creatures of the state, hence the reason why they are completely subsumed in that circle. But during the era of dual federalism, from the founding of the nation up to the Civil War, state governments were seen as sovereign, and they had their own sphere of influence, separate from the sphere of influence of the national government. But in the run-up to the Civil War, we really started to see that conflict that we had talked about last week, the slave state, non-slave state conflict, of course, really coming to a head in the 1840s and the 1850s into 1861. Obviously, slave states, southern states, wanted, when new states were admitted to the Union, they wanted those new states to be slave states. Northern non-slave states wanted new states admitted as non-slave states, as free states. Southern states, slave states, saw Congress as being dominated by the North. They felt that Congress was being dominated by the North, and that these northern states, through Congress, were passing laws that these southern states did not agree with. And so southern states would make the argument that we are sovereign. We came together as states to join this union and form this union. So the logic goes, if the states form the union, the states can then dissolve the union. The states can then leave the union. And that whole argument of the states created the union actually dates back to James Madison. And Madison talked about that in Federalist number 39. And we'll talk more about Federalist 39 after we talk about the Constitution. But in Federalist 39, Madison argues that the anti-federalists shouldn't be afraid of this new constitution, be afraid of this new government, because this new government was created by the states. The states sent delegates to the Constitutional Convention, and the delegates at the Constitutional Convention were there as representatives of their states, not as representatives of themselves as individuals. In order for the new constitution to go into effect, it had to be ratified by at least 9 state legislatures. And so the state legislatures decided whether or not this government, this new nation, would come into existence. And so Madison made the argument that this nation, this union was really created by the states. And then people like John C. Calhoun and others took that logic and used that logic then to end up justifying their eventual secession from the Union. But throughout the 1850s into the 1860s, whenever Congress would pass laws that these southern states would disagree with, these southern states would use a variety of different tools to try and not have to implement these laws. And there are 3 tools that southern states use pretty prominently. One tool that they used was what was called interposition. Now, again, I'll put all this in text chat. So if you don't have text chat open, go ahead and open up your text chat and it'll all be in there. Interposition. Interposition was when a southern state, when it disagreed with the law coming out of Congress, it would use all of the resources at its disposal to stop the implementation of that piece of legislation. So interposition is using your resources to block implementation of the law. And so southern states tried to do that. They just tried to block the implementation. When that did not work, they moved on to a more stringent type of strategy, which was called nullification. In nullification, southern states would just declare an act of Congress to simply be null and void. Well, we know Congress passed this law, but we don't agree with it, so we're going to declare it to be null and void because we are sovereign entities as states. When nullification didn't work, that's when the southern states moved on to the most extreme tool, which was secession. Seceding from the Union, leaving the Union, first started with South Carolina, and then one by one, the Confederate States then seceded from the Union, and we had the Civil War. At the end of the Civil War, 1865, our system of federalism changes again, in that whole idea of states' rights, the whole idea of state sovereignty was essentially dead at the end of the Civil War. The southern states were going through Reconstruction. Congress was controlling all the details of Reconstruction, and it's really very hard for any of these states to argue that they were sovereign after the Civil War. So we shift from the era of dual federalism into, after the Civil War, what has come to be known as competitive federalism. The national and state governments begin to really compete with each other over duties, powers, and responsibilities. And the big difference between competitive federalism and dual federalism is in the size of those circles. So under dual federalism, the state sphere of influence was larger than the national sphere of influence. In competitive federalism, the national sphere of influence begins to grow and begins to become bigger than the state sphere of influence. We're still talking about a coordinated relationship in that the 2 spheres of influence are separate from each other, but the size of the spheres are changing. And if you think about after the Civil War in the late 1800s, all of the things that the national government did to expand its power and its reach over the economy. For instance, they created the Interstate Commerce Commission in order to regulate commerce between the states. They started regulating food quality, food safety. They started regulating the safety of medicine. They started regulating the safety in the workplace. And so as they begin to really extend out their power over regulating the national economy, a lot of those things the national government starts regulating used to be the responsibility of the states. So they started taking those responsibilities from the states, hence the reason why the national sphere grew and the state sphere shrank. But the commonality between dual and competitive federalism is that the model it represents is still that first model there on the left of the inset box, what we call a coordinate authority model. The relationship is one of independence. We have that clear line of demarcation between the national and state governments. It's a coordinate authority model of federalism. And so this competitive era of federalism runs from the end of the Civil War up to the FDR administration and the New Deal. So as we all know, there's the stock market crash in the Great Depression. FDR then gets elected and comes into office in 1933. And his primary goal was to try and pull the nation out of the Great Depression. And the way in which FDR did it is he did it through his New Deal and all these alphabet agencies and the proliferation of all these different programs, national programs, federal government programs, to help state and local governments pull themselves out of the depths of the Great Depression. All of these programs were based upon cooperation between the national and state governments. And so once we get into the New Deal in 1933, the FDR administration, we move into a third era of federalism known as cooperative federalism. Now, some federalism scholars will refer to it as fiscal federalism because the relationship between national and state governments, those relationships were really being dictated very much by money. So we saw a lot of grants and aid that were being given from the national government to state governments to help them come out of the Great Depression. And since this relationship was being dictated by money, a lot of people refer to this era as the beginning of fiscal federalism. But in this cooperative, this fiscal federalism era, we then move to a different model of federalism, which is that middle model in the inset box known as overlapping federalism. So with overlapping federalism, this is where in your Venn diagram, you begin to have your circles overlap with each other. And you begin to see a lot of shared functions between national, state, and local governments. So you'll see in that depiction, there are some things that are the responsibility of all three levels of government. National, state, and local cooperate together in order to carry out these duties and these programs. In some instances, it's the national and state government that work together. In some instances, it's the national and local government that work together. And it's, in some instances, it's state and local governments that are working together. But their functions and duties start to overlap with each other in more of a cooperative type of a relationship. And we see that throughout the New Deal. We see that continuing through the 40s and the 50s and through the John F. Kennedy administration. With the assassination of John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Baines Johnson then ascends to the presidency. And when Johnson becomes president, Johnson has a different take on the relationship between national, state, and local governments. Instead of this purely overlapping type of relationship, Johnson viewed federalism very much like what we see with these three concentric circles on the right side of the inset, an inclusive authority type of model, wherein the local government authority is subsumed within the state government, and state and local governments are both subsumed within the sphere of influence of the national government, called inclusive authority. In this model, state and local governments become dependent upon the national government. It's a very hierarchical approach, where the hierarchy goes national, state, and then finally local. This model of inclusive authority basically says that decisions should be made primarily in Washington, D.C. Decisions should be made primarily at the national level and then handed down to state and local governments through a couple of different types of tools. So two of the tools that Johnson used in his era of federalism, which came to be known as creative federalism, were things such as mandates and categorical grants. Now, with mandates, a mandate is an order. And so a mandate is where the national government will order a state or local government to take a certain type of action. So you will do this. A categorical grant is more the carrot as opposed to the stick approach. The mandate, the stick approach. The carrot approach is the categorical grant, where we will try and induce you to follow these national objectives and accomplish these national goals with federal grant money. But the federal grant money is going to be categorical in nature, meaning that it's going to be a very specific grant, whereby this national money can only be used for specific types of things, specific types of expenditures. And if you are a state or local government receiving a categorical grant, you are going to have reporting requirements. You're going to be held accountable for how you are spending this national money. The categorical grant was a very useful tool for Johnson in his era of creative federalism because it was a way in which he could again get state and local governments to do the bidding of the national government. So it was a very hierarchical, top-down type of relationship between national, state, and local governments. Decisions were being made in Washington, D.C. And the two big programs that Johnson was trying to further with his creative federalism approaches, the War on Poverty and the Great Society. Johnson wanted to focus on disparities in wealth, and he wanted to reduce those disparities between the poorest Americans and the wealthiest Americans. And so he was using a lot of these mandates and categorical grants to try and reduce that disparity in that war on poverty. Again, a national objective established at the national level of government, and then using tools to get the compliance and then coerce state and local governments to achieve those national goals and objectives. But this era of creative federalism was very short-lived. It was during the Johnson administration. But if you know your presidential history at all, you understand that the Johnson administration was mired in the Vietnam War. Johnson's approval ratings were relatively low, sometimes very low. And so Johnson decided not to seek the nomination of the Democratic Party in the election of 1968. So when Johnson did not run for re-election in the election of 68, Richard Nixon, Republican, won the White House. And when Richard Nixon comes into the White House in 1969, he essentially takes Johnson's creative federalism and completely does the diametric opposite of it, completely flips it on its head. And the era of federalism that we usually associate with Nixon is what has been called new federalism. They said, let's get rid of this creative federalism, let's get rid of this inclusive authority model, and let's go try a new approach to federalism. And Nixon's new approach to federalism was really based upon turning functions and responsibilities and authority over to state and local governments. Nixon really saw that it was subnational governments, state and local governments, that were closer to the people. And so what government would know what's in the best interest of their citizens better than a state or local government that is closer to the people than the national government? So Nixon, in turning these responsibilities over to state and local governments, used a variety of different tools in order to accomplish his new federalism. One tool that he used was decentralization. So Nixon believed that we should decentralize decision-making. We should allow state and local governments to be involved in making decisions that will affect them and affect their citizens on a daily basis. So essentially give state and local governments a seat at the decision-making table, a seat that they did not have in creative federalism under the Johnson administration. In addition to decentralization, a second tool he liked to use was referred to as devolution. So if decentralization is giving them a seat at the decision-making table, allowing them to participate in decision-making, devolution speaks to giving them the resources to carry out the decisions that they make. It's one thing to say, okay, you can make your own decisions, but it's another thing to give them the resources to be able to carry out their decisions. Giving the resources to carry out those decisions, that was referred to as devolution, a devolution of power, a devolution of resources from the national level down to the state and local level. And the way in which he was going to try and devolve resources down to the state and local level was by using something called general revenue sharing. In general revenue sharing, the national government would literally turn over a percentage of federal income tax revenue to state governments and say, here you go, here's a percentage of our revenue. You can do what you want with this money. There are no strings attached. There's very little accountability. You can just go and use the money for what you think you need to use the money for. Now, the problem with general revenue sharing is that throughout the Nixon administration, in fact, beginning in the Nixon administration in 1969, we started running budget deficits. And every year since 1969, all the way through 1998, the federal government ran a budget deficit where its expenditures exceeded its revenue. So after the national government was done spending its money, it didn't have any revenue left to share with state and local governments. So state and local governments really didn't get much money at all out of general revenue sharing. But that was the tool Nixon wanted to use to try and devolve resources to state and local governments. And then the third D, if you will, was deregulation. So Nixon wanted to remove some of these what he considered cumbersome regulations that were being placed upon state and local governments, as well as being placed upon the private sector. He thought you remove those regulations, you free up state and local governments and the private sector to do what they do best and allow them to have the flexibility to do what they feel they need to do for their citizens without having to be held accountable for these national types of regulations. So decentralization, devolution, and deregulation. Nixon's approach, the 3 Ds of Nixon's new federalism. Now, Nixon was in office, obviously, until he resigned, and then Gerald Ford took over. Then Gerald Ford was in office until Jimmy Carter was inaugurated in January of 1977. When Carter comes in, we have a little bit of a break in new federalism, in that we start to see some more decisions being made at the national level as opposed to being left to state and local governments. But then when Ronald Reagan comes into the White House in January of 1981, he revives Nixon's new federalism. And Reagan's approach to federalism was very similar, almost a carbon copy, to Nixon's approach with new federalism. Reagan, again, like Nixon, wanted to deregulate. He wanted to turn over responsibilities and authority, decision-making authority, to state and local governments. The tools that Reagan used in his approach to new federalism were somewhat different than the tools that Richard Nixon used. Again, general revenue sharing didn't work because the federal government literally did not have any revenue to share with state and local governments. So instead of general revenue sharing, what Ronald Reagan used is he used the block grant. I remember back in creative federalism under Lyndon Johnson, we said one of the main tools that Lyndon Johnson used, he used these categorical grants, these very specific grants with a lot of strings attached, a lot of accountability mechanisms. Reagan used what he called block grants. A block grant is a much more general grant of money in which you can use those block grant proceeds for a variety of different expenditures as long as how you are spending the money helps you achieve programmatic goals. So as long as, the example I oftentimes use is the example of educating at-risk youth. So you have a goal of educating at-risk youth. With a categorical grant, you would get a categorical grant and have to spend it on one specific thing. So you might get a grant for after-school counseling programs, and it would have to be spent on after-school counseling programs. However, with a block grant, you would get a block grant of money that you could spend on after-school counseling if you wanted, or if you preferred, you could spend that money on midnight basketball programs, or on job training programs, or on childcare programs, as long as how you're spending the money will help you achieve the goal of educating at-risk youth. Ronald Reagan took 187 categorical grant programs and combined them together into 12 block grant programs. The good thing about that for state and local governments is it gave them a lot more flexibility because now they had 12 block grants as opposed to 187 very specific categorical grants. Removed a lot of the paperwork and reporting requirements. And so they loved that. What they didn't love about it is Reagan used it as a budget cutting tool. So he said, we're going to give you a lot more flexibility in how you spend this money, but we're also going to take some of the funding away. So it's a bittersweet pill for a lot of these state and local governments to try and swallow. They got more autonomy and flexibility, but they ended up losing some of the money they had become reliant upon. We see new federalism running through the Reagan administration again, redo of new federalism, and through the George H.W. Bush administration. And then we get to the Clinton administration in January of 1993. I would make the argument that in the Clinton administration, we ushered in our modern era of federalism, which I like to refer to as contextual federalism. In contextual federalism, our belief about which level of government should be responsible for which activities and functions is dependent more on the issue than it is dependent upon the ideology. So for Lyndon Johnson back in creative federalism, he believed regardless of the issue, the decision should pretty much be made at the national level. And then the national government gets state and local governments to accomplish its goals. For Nixon and for Reagan, from an ideological perspective, the power resided with the states and the local governments. And it should be the state and local governments who have the ability to make these types of decisions. And again, that was across the vast majority of issues. It was very ideological in nature. Beginning with the Clinton administration and moving through George W. Bush and Barack Obama and Donald Trump and now into the Joe Biden administration, we take a much more contextual issue-based focus when we're talking about federalism. And let me give you a couple of examples. In the Clinton administration, you had a Democratic president who joined together with a Republican majority in Congress to come up with welfare reform. And in the mid-1990s, 1996, we got this piece of legislation called the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. That's just a big, long name for welfare reform. Welfare reform was predicated on replacing categorical grants with block grants. So we took the old Assistance to Families with Dependent Children, the old AFDC categorical grants, and we replaced them with a new type of block grant called Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, or TANF grants, Temporary Assistance to Needy Families. Those TANF grants were block grants. And so replacing categorical grants with block grants should sound very familiar because that's exactly what we saw done in the Reagan administration with Reagan's approach to new federalism. So when it came to welfare reform, you had a Democratic president who was very willing to decentralize and devolve and deregulate down to the state and the local level. Contrast that to another issue. And so also in the Clinton administration, there was a pretty heated discussion about what were called blood alcohol content levels, or BACs. And a blood alcohol content level is obviously the level that you use to determine drunk driving. And so what the Clinton administration wanted is they wanted a national 0.08 blood alcohol content standard. And they want all states to have a 0.08 blood alcohol content level. Different states had different back levels. Some states had a 0.10, some had a 0.12, some had a 0.14. States were really all over the map. So what the Clinton administration wanted to do is they wanted the national government standard to be the standard for all states and take away state autonomy to come up with their own blood alcohol content levels. And the way in which he did it is he used a certain type of mandate known as a crossover mandate. With a crossover mandate, you can get a state or local government to take an action in one area by threatening to take money away from them in another area. So he threatened, if you do not adopt the national 0.08 blood alcohol standard, blood alcohol content standard, if you don't do that, then we're going to take highway funds away from you, and you lose your federal highway funds for highway construction and bridge reconstruction, and we're going to take that money from you. Again, that sounds a lot more like creative federalism and Lyndon Johnson than it does Ronald Reagan and New Federalism. So for blood alcohol content levels, it looked a lot like creative federalism. For welfare reform, it looked a lot like Reagan's New Federalism. And that was all within one administration. A similar thing in the George W. Bush administration. For the most part, the Bush administration talked a lot about decentralizing power down to state and local government. But when it came to education policy, that's where we ended up seeing the No Child Left Behind Act. And the No Child Left Behind Act centralized power at the national level, establishing national standards, and then holding states accountable for achieving those national standards. That, again, sounds a whole lot like Lyndon Baines Johnson and his creative federalism, inclusive authority type of model. And we can go through all of our administrations. And for each administration, modern administration, we may see a predisposition toward one approach to federalism over another, but depending upon the issue, we can see them act the complete opposite way. And so I think our federalism today is very contextual, it's very issue-based, and we really decide the proper role of national, state, and local governments depending upon the issue itself. What that means for us in studying American federalism is it makes our job more difficult, because it means we really are going to have to take a very nuanced look at these different issues to understand what federalism looks like in the proper balance of power between national, state, and local government. We can't just say, well, this person's a Republican, so they are going to want to devolve resources and decentralize decision-making to state and local government. Or this person's a Democrat, so they're going to want to centralize things at the national level. It's hard to say that anymore. We really have to look at the context of these specific issues. But one really important takeaway from kind of this protracted discussion of the development of federalism, this vertical separation of powers, is that federalism is very much of a dynamic concept. It's a concept that changes over time. And one of the reasons why it changes so much over time is that the Supreme Court is the ultimate arbiter of these questions of federalism. So when it comes to interpreting, is it the Supremacy Clause versus the 10th Amendment, the Commerce Clause versus the 10th Amendment, which one wins? Those decisions often get made by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has kind of bounced back and forth depending upon the membership on the court in terms of centralizing power in Washington, D.C. versus decentralizing power and protecting states' rights. It really depends upon the era that you're looking at. In the 1990s, the court really was very much predisposed to protecting state and local rights and arguing that the 10th Amendment to the Constitution is just as important as any other amendment in the Bill of Rights. Again, now with the conservative makeup of the Supreme Court, we're again seeing them move more toward state sovereignty, moving more toward decentralizing and devolving power to state governments. But we really cannot overstate the role of the Supreme Court in determining the nature of federalism and making those interpretations of what the Constitution really means when it comes to the relationship between national, state, and local governments. Well, so what? You know, I told you, I think in our first night of class, I have a favorite answer, and it depends. Just like with contextual federalism, it depends upon the issue. But I also have a favorite question. My favorite question is, so what? Okay, so what? So we have this system of separation of powers, executive, legislative, and judicial. So what? We have the system of American federalism with national, state, and local governments. What does it mean then for public administration and what we do as public administrators? Well, clearly, one of the main implications is we serve many masters. We serve the executive branch, obviously. We serve the chief executive within the executive branch. But we are also held accountable by the legislature through its oversight function. Legislatures have the power of the purse. They have power over appropriations. They use those appropriation powers in order to oversee the activities of federal or executive level agencies. So you have to be accountable to the legislature as well. We also have to be accountable to the judiciary, in that the judiciary can issue what are called writs. And so they'll issue a writ of mandamus. That's a legal term that means an order. Now, if they issue a writ of mandamus, they are ordering an executive official, sometimes a public administrator, to take a certain type of action. And so we're being held accountable to all three branches of government. But we also being held accountable vertically to national, state, as well as local governments. And we see national governments oftentimes engage in what we call indirect administration, where they'll provide the resources, and then state and local governments are responsible for the direct administration, the actual production of the goods and services for citizens. So we oftentimes have all three levels of government that are involved in any one given policy or program. And so we have to be accountable to all three of those levels of government. Working at the local level, we know that, you know, the old adage in federalism is everything flows downhill in federalism with the exception of money. So we don't get a whole lot of money flowing down, but we get a lot of orders and we get a lot of mandates, and we get a lot of responsibilities that are handed down from the national to the state to the local levels of government. At the local level, you know, my experience working on a local school board, that local school board was a special purpose government. And as a special purpose government, it only really had responsibility for one policy area, which was education. So, you know, school district's a special purpose government. It deals with education policy. A sewer district or a water district is a special purpose district dealing with one policy area, as opposed to a general purpose government. the local level, you have general purpose governments like cities and counties. Cities and counties have the responsibility for a large array of different types of policies and programs. As a special purpose government, you have more masters that you have to serve than a general purpose government. As a general purpose governments have more control over their budgets. They have more control over conducting their own elections. For a special purpose government, you don't have control, complete control over your budget. When we would adopt a budget, that budget would then have to go to the county, and the county would then have to approve that budget. The county didn't approve that budget, and they kicked it back to the district, you would have to redo your budget. So you're accountable to the county the county Office of Education. If you wanted to change your elections, and you wanted to, like when I was on the board, we moved from odd year to even year elections, and we moved from at-large to district-based elections. That not only had to be approved by the county Office of Education, it also had to be approved by the county registrar, and it also had to be approved by the County Committee on School District Reorganization. So we had 3 different hoops that we had to jump through at the local level as being a special purpose government. So we serve many masters because of this division of power and responsibilities. Serving many masters means that we get a lot of conflicting direction. And so sometimes we are told to take one direction from the state government, and then we're told to do a different thing by the county. And one of the frustrating things during COVID is a lot of local governments, the state of California was saying one thing, and then the Los Angeles County Department of Public Health was saying something completely different. And you had these conflicting directions coming from different levels of government. Because of all these different conflicting directions and all these different players and actors who are involved, public administration in our system of federalism and separation of powers means that we operate within a very complex network of cooperation and competition. We have agencies, local agencies working together in partnerships. We have local governments working together with nonprofit organizations. We have local governments working together with private sector organizations. We have state and local partnerships. Sometimes we have national and local partnerships. So we have very complex, what we call governing networks. And, whoops, sorry about that. And this idea of governing networks is really something that is not really new in public administration, but has really become very much of an emphasis over the past couple of decades. You can't just study an agency anymore. You can't just study one organization. You have to study the governing network in which that organization operates, because you have so many complex networks of cooperation and competition between so many entities, so many organizations, and so many individuals. This complex network of cooperation and competition creates for us a unique environment for public administration. And the author I have there on the screen, John Gauss, G-A-U-S, very famous public administration theorist, won all kinds of awards during his time. And he's most known for his recognition of what he called the environment or the ecology of public administration. He argues to understand why agencies do what they do and to understand why public administrators do what they do, we must first understand the environment in which they operate. We have to understand the stakeholders in that environment. We have to understand how supportive the environment is. We have to understand what types of challenges are going on in the environment. We have to understand how dynamic or how static the environment is. And to understand public administration today, we have to go beyond the walls of one organization and beyond just one individual public administrator and really look at the entire system and the entire environment that surrounds public administration. Next week, when we get into our discussion of public versus private sector differences, we will spend a lot of time talking about the unique environment of public administration as opposed to the environment that surrounds private organizations. And we'll talk about why we need different theories and why we need different approaches for studying the unique environment of public administration, as opposed to just borrowing straight from the world of business administration and trying to apply those theories to our public environments. So it really does make a difference doing public administration within our democratic republic and doing public administration within our system of government predicated upon separation of powers and our system of American federalism. So that kind of wraps up our primer or refresher for some of you on the foundational aspects of American government. Any questions or observations on any of this information from the second half of class last week or the first half of class for this week? Because if not, I would propose, it's about 5:06, I propose let's go ahead and take a break. And let's take a break until 5:15. And then when we return at 5:15, I'll have the Constitution, we'll share out the Constitution, and we'll go through the Constitution, talk about some of the specific elements in the Constitution that we really need to be very mindful of as public administrators. And again, I think it's important to have one point in time in the program where you actually sit down and look at the Constitution. I don't know if there's another course in the program where you're going to be doing it, but I think it's important for us to take the time to do it tonight. So we'll do that after our break. So come on back at 5:15 and we'll have a discussion of the Constitution. All right, well, welcome back, everyone. Let me get my chat window opened up again. All right, again, I think it's important that we spend some time going through the Constitution. It's probably the only time in the program we get the opportunity to do that. And as we talked about as public administrators, under qualified good faith immunity, we are held accountable for making sure that we understand the constitutional rights of those that we are dealing with, and to then endeavor not to violate those rights. And so it's important for us to know what the Constitution says about the balance of power, not just between different governments, but between government and people, and then how we can protect the constitutional rights of those that we deal with on a daily basis. So let's go through the Constitution. Again, hopefully you had a chance to look at it on your own. We're not going to go through all of the parts of the Constitution. We're just going to hit the highlights from each of the articles and each of the 27 amendments. So there are going to be some things in the Constitution you'll see me kind of glide past because we have limited amount of time, and this isn't necessarily a class on the Constitution, but we'll spend about an hour or so going through the Constitution, and then we'll see how we're doing on time. I assume we probably won't have enough time to do our entire discussion of accountability and ethics. So then at the end of class, I'll show you those 8 principles in the ASPA Code of Ethics, just to get you prepared to then do Canvas essay number 2, which is due next week. But first things first, let's talk about the Constitution. The federal Constitution is a very well organized document. It is made up of 7 articles and made up of 27 amendments. So over 200 plus years, we've only amended the Constitution 27 times. And the most recent amendment to the Constitution was in 1992. So it's been 30 odd years since we have amended the Constitution. That is much different than the California state constitution. And we have to be mindful of the fact that as public administrators here in the state of California, we are not only protecting people's rights under the federal constitution, but we're also protecting people's rights under the state constitution as well. The California state constitution is much longer and much more detailed than the federal constitution. In fact, the California state constitution consists of 35 different articles as opposed to 7 articles in the federal constitution, and is not only one of the longest constitutions in the country, it is one of the longest constitutions in the entire world. Whereas we've only amended the federal constitution 27 times, we've amended the California state constitution over 500 times. And the way in which we amend the state constitution is different than the federal constitution. Now, the federal constitution, whenever we add an amendment to the constitution, the amendment gets added at the end of the constitution. So you've got the constitution, and then you have your 27 amendments in chronological order. In the California state constitution, we don't just append amendments to the end of the constitution. We actually go in and make substantive changes to the language of the constitution with each one of our constitutional amendments. Does anyone have any idea why the California state constitution has so many more amendments than the federal constitution and is so much longer than the federal constitution? Any ideas why that's the case? It kind of goes back to what we discussed last week. And this idea of initiatives and referenda. Here in the state of California, we can use the initiative and the referendum process in order to amend our Constitution. There is no national initiative for a referendum process that can be used to amend the federal Constitution. In order to amend the federal Constitution, you have to go through a two-step process. We'll talk about that when we talk about Article 5, but it's a much higher bar that you have to reach in order to amend the federal Constitution as opposed to the California state Constitution. But there are some similarities between the California state Constitution and the federal Constitution. Just like at the federal level, we have a bicameral legislature. We also have a bicameral legislature here in the state of California. We have a California State Assembly and we have a California State Senate. The number of seats in the California legislature is obviously going to be smaller than what we have at the federal level. As you all know, at the federal level in the House of Representatives, we have 435 members of the House and we have 100 members of the Senate. A grand total of 535 voting members of the US Congress. Now, there are also shadow delegates who are from non-states, so from territories. And so you have some shadow delegates who serve from the US Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico and some of the territories, but 535 total voting members in the US Congress. In the California State Legislature, we have 80 seats in the California Assembly, and we have 40 seats in the California State Senate. So a total of 100 seats overall in the California State Legislature. Whereas at the federal level, we have we usually have divided government, and we have very slim margins in terms of the party representation in the House and the Senate. In California, we have a Democratic supermajority in both the California State Assembly as well as the California State Senate. And added to that, a Democratic governor, and you really have very much one-party unified government in California, as opposed to the divided government that we typically see at the federal level. Let's talk a little bit more about what the Constitution has to say about this legislative branch at the federal level. So we know from our discussion last week, one of the major conflicts of the Constitutional Convention was the large state, small state conflict. Large states wanted proportional representation in Congress. Small states wanted equal representation. We said through the Connecticut Compromise, the way in which the framers dealt with that is to create this bicameral legislature, a House of Representatives, and a US Senate. And that bicameral legislature is then established then in Article 1, Section 1. Article 1 of the Constitution is all about Congress, the organization of Congress, the powers of Congress, what Congress can and cannot do. All of that is spelled out in Article 1 of the Constitution. Article 1 of the Constitution is by far the longest and most detailed article. That leads some political scientists to make the argument that Congress is the quote unquote first branch of government. It's spoken of first in the Constitution, Article 1, and the framers spent a lot more time and a lot more effort detailing Congress in Article 1 than they spend detailing the presidency in Article 2, and certainly a lot more time than they spend detailing the Supreme Court in Article number 3. So we have this bicameral Congress set up in Article 1, Section 1. Then Article 1, Section 2, we move into our discussion of the House of Representatives. And as you know, members of the House of Representatives serve 2-year terms. In order to be a member of the House of Representatives, you must be at least 25 years old. You must have been a citizen of the United States for at least 7 years, and you must be an inhabitant of the state in which you are being elected from. The House of Representatives was designed to be the House closest to the people. And so that's why you have popular election of members of the House, and you have proportional representation in the House of Representatives as well. The House of Representatives has one office that is spoken of directly in the Constitution, and that is the office of Speaker of the House. That is a constitutional position. Speaker of the House, we saw the protracted voting for Speaker of the House when Kevin McCarthy was elected Speaker back in January. It took 15 ballots for Kevin McCarthy to be elected as Speaker. That's highly unusual. Usually it's a one ballot type of deal. But the Speaker of the House then serves in the line of succession for the president. And so you have the Vice President who's first in line, and then you go to the Speaker of the House. So it's a very important constitutional position basically in charge of the House of Representatives. Then Section 3 talks about the US Senate. The US Senate obviously is smaller. It is based upon equal representation. You serve 6-year terms in the US Senate, and 1/3 of the Senate is up for election every 2 years. So we have staggered elections. So all 100 members of the Senate do not come up for election all in the same year. In order to serve in the Senate, you must be at least 30 years old. You must have been a citizen of the United States for 9 years and be an inhabitant of the state that you are being elected from. So the standards are higher to be in the US Senate. Members of the US Senate under the Constitution were not popularly elected. Members of the Senate were selected by state legislatures. And there are a couple of reasons why the framers had that provision. One reason why senators are not popularly elected is somewhat of a distrust in everyday average voters. And they really had more trust and faith in state legislatures to decide who the senators should be as opposed to a popular election. But also, it goes back to this Federalist, anti-Federalist conflict at the Constitutional Convention. This was a nod to the anti-Federalists. The state legislatures would be able to decide who would be serving in that Senate as opposed to everyday average voters. And again, that gives a nod to state sovereignty and allays some of the fears of the anti-Federalists. The president of the Senate, as I'm sure you all know, is the vice president of the United States, but the vice president, when serving as president of the Senate, may only vote in the occasion of a tie. So only if there's a tie can the vice president cast a vote. We saw that with Vice President Harris going over to Congress in the last session and breaking a tie. That's something that happens, more frequently recently than it did in the past, just because the margins in Congress in the Senate are much narrower than they used to be 10, 20, or 30 years ago. In terms of impeachments, the House of Representatives has the ability to pass articles of impeachment, and then the trial for impeachment occurs in the US Senate. And in the last administration, the Trump administration, we saw 2 impeachment trials for former President Trump. Prior to that, we had an impeachment trial back in the 1990s for former President Bill Clinton. And way back in the 1860s, we had an impeachment trial for former President Andrew Johnson. For the 2 Trump impeachment trials, Trump was acquitted in both of those. In the Clinton impeachment trial, he was acquitted in his trial as well. Andrew Johnson, back in the 1860s, was also acquitted in his impeachment trial, but he was acquitted by only 1 vote. So he came 1 vote away from being the only president to be removed from office through the impeachment process. Whenever the Senate is doing impeachments, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court presides over the impeachment trial. Every senator must take an oath before they sit in judgment of whomever is being impeached. It doesn't just have to be presidents. You can impeach vice presidents, you can impeach justices, you can impeach judges. So a lot of federal officials can be subject to an impeachment process. Obviously, presidential impeachments are the ones that get all of the media coverage. So the Senate has the sole power to try those impeachments. In terms of positions in the Senate, the position in the Senate that's spoken of in the Constitution is a position known as President Pro Tem. The President Pro Tem, or Pro Tempore, how we like to say it, we usually say President Pro Tem of the Senate, is typically the longest serving member from the majority party. Now, the longest serving member from the Democratic Party in the Senate is Dianne Feinstein from here in California. Dianne Feinstein was obviously offered the position of President Pro Tem, but turned it down because it looks like Senator Feinstein's not going to be running for re-election. And so now the President Pro Tem of the Senate is Senator Patty Murray from the state of Washington. So Patty Murray is the President Pro Tem of the US Senate. Again, there's a lot of information in here, specifics about the Senate that we don't really have time to go through. I just want to hit some of the highlights. Section 5 talks about the journal. Sometimes when you watch C-SPAN or C-SPAN 2, you'll see members of the House or members of the Senate get up and will, during their speech, either at the beginning or at the end, will say, usually at the beginning, will say, I request the right to revise and extend my remarks. When they say revise and extend their remarks, They mean that they want to put everything they're not able to say, everything they don't have time to say on the floor, to put all that into the congressional record. And that's the way in which it then gets immortalized. And if you care to, you can go and read their full comments, even though they oftentimes don't have time to give those comments on the floor. One big difference between the House and the Senate and the way in which it operates is that the House of Representatives has very regimented, very strict time limits for debate. The Senate does not. And you're probably familiar with the filibuster in the Senate, that any single member of the Senate can slow down and stop the consideration of legislation by just getting up on the floor and talking. That's called a filibuster. In order to stop a filibuster, you need to get what's called a vote of cloture. And it's not closure, it's cloture, so it's with a T. You need to get a vote of cloture, but then text chat. And in order to get a vote of cloture, you typically need to get 60 senators to agree. That then shuts down the filibuster and allows the Senate to proceed with its business. The Senate is a much more collegial, egalitarian body than the US House. For a piece of legislation to get to the floor of the House, again, this is not in the Constitution, this is just the way in which it operates. A piece of legislation to get to the floor of the House must first go through the Rules Committee. And the Rules Committee is a very powerful committee in the House. The Rules Committee will then pass the rules that will allow the piece of legislation to get to the floor and will then dictate how much time will be allotted for debate, will dictate if there are any amendments that can be added to the piece of legislation on the floor. All of those are in that rule that is passed by the Rules Committee. In the Senate, a piece of legislation goes to the floor through what's called a unanimous consent agreement, or a UCA. A unanimous consent agreement means that all senators must agree before a piece of legislation can go to the floor of the Senate. So one single senator can stand up and at least temporarily stop a piece of legislation from being discussed on the floor of the Senate. That typically doesn't happen because there's this quid pro quo in the Senate that if I'm going to stop your piece of legislation, you're probably going to end up trying to stop my piece of legislation. So it's kind of this log rolling that I won't stop yours if you don't stop mine. Section 7 is important in that Section 7 lays out some specific processes in the House and the Senate. One specific thing laid out in Article 1, Section 7 is that all revenue bills, all bills that generate revenue and raise taxation, all those bills must start in the House of Representatives. The reason why the framers did that is they thought everyday average citizens would be very interested in any tax legislation. And so any tax legislation should start in the House that is closest to the people, because those members of the House have to run for re-election every 2 years. They are popularly elected. And so it just stands to reason that any increases in taxation should always start in the House of Representatives. Section 7 also lays out the process by which the Congress can override a presidential veto. That presidents do have veto power, but that can be overridden by a 2/3 vote of both the House as well as the Senate. Overriding a presidential veto is historically very difficult to do. There are some presidents that go through their entire 4-year term without ever having a piece of legislation overridden or their veto overridden by the House and the Senate. If you're a president, you've had multiple pieces of legislation where you vetoed and your veto has been overridden, that's usually not a very good sign for the power you have as a president. All bills, before they can go to the president for the president's signature, must be passed in the House and the Senate in identical versions. That's why the House and the Senate use these things called conference committees, because once a bill gets passed by the House and then it gets passed by the Senate, those two bills oftentimes are not identical to each other. The House version looks a lot different than the Senate version. So you'll then have a conference committee. Those conferees on that committee will hammer out the differences between the House and the Senate version. Then that uniform piece of legislation that the conference committee agrees on then goes back to the House and the Senate for final passage before it can go to the president for the president's signature. Article 1, Section 8 is perhaps the single most important section in the entire Constitution. And this is a section that lays out the powers of Congress. And this is what a lot of anti-federalists were very concerned about. So in Article 1, Section 8, we lay out what we call the enumerated powers of Congress. And when you enumerate a power, all you're really doing is you're listing. So this is a listing of all the powers that Congress has. When you enumerate, when you list powers, by definition, you are limiting power, because the assumption is if it's not listed in the Constitution, then it is not a power that belongs to Congress. So whenever you list powers, you are by definition limiting the powers of Congress. So as we all know, Congress has the power to lay and collect taxation. They have the ability to borrow money. They have the ability to regulate commerce. Now, this is an important one. This is what's known as the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. The Congress has the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states. When Congress tries to expand its power in federalism over state governments, it oftentimes does so based upon this Commerce Clause. Congress will argue, we can tell a state to do this or to not do something because it has direct implications for that state's commerce with other states, in what we call interstate commerce. The Supreme Court has taken a stricter view in recent years of the Commerce Clause power of the Congress, saying that in order for Congress to use its Commerce Clause power, it must demonstrate a direct tie between what it's wanting to do and interstate commerce. If the connection between those two things are not clear, then that's something that probably the Supreme Court will say is not within the purview of Congress to do. When Congress tries to expand its power, it oftentimes uses that Commerce Clause. So a very important part of Article 1, Section 8. Establish uniform rule of naturalization to coin money. Again, this was to rectify some of the problems in the Articles of Confederation. So we talked about last week under the Articles, we had different states that had different currencies. And so it made trade and interstate commerce next to impossible. So here we go, giving Congress the ability and the sole ability to coin money and to punish counterfeiting of some of that coined money. Congress has the power to establish post offices, which is why we have the U.S. Postal Service today as a government corporation. Has the power to promote the progress of science and the useful arts. So this is why Congress authorized the National Science Foundation. To constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court. A really simple sentence that is a huge power for Congress. In Article 3 of the Constitution established one court. It established the U.S. Supreme Court. And it said all other courts inferior are then created by Congress. Congress then went and created the rest of the federal judiciary. So Congress is the one through the Judiciary Act that created courts of appeal, that created the federal district court system. All of that is a power of Congress. Any court below the Supreme Court was created by Congress. The ability to punish piracies and felonies on the high seas, to declare war. Only Congress may declare war. Presidents may not declare war. Now, presidents may engage in military action, and presidents can send the military to different parts of the world for peacekeeping functions or whatever the case may be. But only Congress has the ability to officially declare war. We've had two official declarations of war, World War I and World War II. And in both of those instances, the president went before a joint session of Congress and asked for a declaration of war. And if you're interested, a little piece of trivia is there is one person in Congress who voted against both World War I as well as World War II. And that was a representative by the name of Jeanette Rankin. And she was the only one in World War II to vote against that declaration of war. Congress has the ability to raise and support armies, to provide and maintain a navy, again, to try and rectify some of the concern with the lack of national defense under the Articles of Confederation. Calling forth the militia. We'll talk more about militias when we get to the Second Amendment and the importance of militias in the minds of the framers. Let's go on down. District of Columbia, this whole idea that we have this neutral district of Columbia, again, that comes to us from the Constitution, and Congress then has control over that area known as the district. And then as you get to the end of Article 1, Section 8, you have a very important clause in there known as the elastic clause. Sometimes people call it the necessary and proper clause. To make all laws, Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by the Constitution in the government of the United States. In other words, Congress can do whatever it needs to do and pass whatever laws it feels it needs to pass in order to be able to carry out all these powers and duties that we've already enumerated in Article 1, Section 8. So when Congress tries to expand its power over state and local governments in our system of federalism, it typically uses either the elastic clause here or the commerce clause that we spoke of before. Sometimes it will use both in combination with each other. But those are the two parts of Article 1, Section 8 that Congress relies upon to expand its power in our system of federalism. So the elastic clause is a very broad grant of power. And again, it's something that really fit the needs of the Federalists, but something the Anti-Federalists were clearly very concerned about. So to alleviate some of those concerns in Section 9, we have some specific limitations on things that Congress cannot do. The first one was the compromise to try and deal with the slave, non-slave conflict at the Constitutional Convention. The slave trade could not be banned until at least the year 1808. And so this is, again, the framers making a very poor compromise to punt this issue to a future generation, but it was a compromise that they made to get representatives from slave states to agree to signing off on the Constitution. Congress may not suspend the writ of habeas corpus, and you're probably familiar with the term writ of habeas corpus in our criminal justice system. Writ of habeas corpus literally means to present the body. And so you have to, if you're arresting someone, you can't just lock them away in a cell and not say where they are or what they're charged with. You have to present the body. You have to let everyone know where that person is at. You can't just hide them away secretively. You can't. So Congress cannot do that, cannot suspend that requirement to present the body, that writ of habeas corpus. Congress shall make no laws of bills of attainder. A bill of attainder is basically finding someone guilty without a trial. So you cannot say this person is guilty without the benefit of having a trial. Congress also shall pass no ex post facto laws. An ex post facto law is an after the fact law, meaning that you did something yesterday and it was completely legal yesterday, but then tomorrow Congress passes law making it illegal and then goes back and punishes you for doing something that was legal when you did it. That would be an ex post after the fact law. You cannot have those types of laws passed by Congress. In the original Constitution, there was also this provision that all taxes passed by Congress had to be apportioned according to population. In other words, states with larger populations would pay more in taxes than states with smaller populations. So some people will tell you today, you do not have to pay your federal income taxes because the original Constitution did not allow for a direct income tax on individual incomes. But that was true prior to 1913 and the passage of the 16th Amendment. As we'll see, the 16th Amendment pretty much gives Congress the ability to levy taxation on any source whatsoever without this type of apportionment. So as a result of the 16th Amendment, you do have to pay your federal income taxes. So don't listen to them, make sure you pay your federal income taxes. Some other things here, a really important one is that Congress cannot withdraw money from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. What this means is Congress cannot just take money from the Treasury without saying what that money is being spent on. The appropriations process is the process of saying, this is what this money is being spent on. So they have to go through that appropriations process. Congress cannot grant any titles of nobility. So you can't have Congress make you a knight or make you a sir. You have to go over to England if you want to try and get that. And then Article 1, Section 10 places some limitations on state governments. So state governments may not enter into treaties. Only the national government can enter into a treaty. The president enters into a treaty, and then that treaty is then subject to advice and consent of the US Senate. States cannot coin money. That's a domain of the national government only. And then just like with the Congress, states cannot have bills of attainder, they cannot pass ex post facto laws, they cannot grant any titles of nobility. They have very limited power in terms of levying what we call imposts and duties on imports and exports. Again, those tariffs are going to be the responsibility of Congress and the national government, not the responsibility of state governments. States cannot keep armies, standing armies. Now they're allowed to have militias, but they can't keep standing armies. The standing army and the raising of army and navy is the responsibility of the national government in Congress. So that's Article 1, laying out the powers of the Congress, laying out the limitations on what Congress cannot do, as well as some limitations on what state governments are not able to do either. So that kind of gives you our basic framework of federalism and the basic division of powers between national and state government. Article 2 then turns its attention to the executive branch, and Article 2 is much shorter and less detailed than Article 1. So the executive power is vested in a president of the United States. The president serves a 4-year term. In order to be president, you have to be at least 35 years old, and you have to be a natural born citizen. So unlike being in the House and the Senate, to be president, you have to actually be born in the United States, be a natural born citizen. It also then lays out for us the Electoral College. Now, the Electoral College obviously has been changed, but the idea of the Electoral College was twofold. One reason why we have the Electoral College is, again, that the framers did not trust entirely the decisions made by voters. So the idea was to have these electors, and these electors would be more informed and more educated about government and politics, and would be able to serve as a check on the popular sentiment of the public, to make sure we have a president who is being selected who is qualified for the position. And secondly, the Electoral College gives power to state governments, because each state will have a number of electors equal to its representation in the House +2 for its representation in the Senate. So as you're not going off popular vote, you actually give small states at least a few votes in the Electoral College. Now, the smallest number of Electoral College votes is 3 for our smallest states. And of course, here in California, we have the most electoral votes because we have the most representatives in the House of Representatives based upon population. These electors, obviously, states will gain or lose electors depending upon the census, and the Constitution requires that we do every 10-year enumeration of the population, where we actually go out there and count the number of people living in the United States, and then we use that as the basis for determining representation in the House of Representatives, and therefore will have an impact upon the number of electors that each state has. Now, you're probably familiar with the way in which the Electoral College works, but the way in which the Electoral College works today is we have 538 electors in the Electoral College. 435 represent 435 seats in the House of Representatives, 100 seats in the Senate. The additional 3 come from the District of Columbia. And we gave the District of Columbia 3 Electoral College votes. That gets us up to 538 total Electoral College votes. To win the Electoral College, you have to win a majority, which is 270 today. The way in which the process works is that based upon the popular vote in the state, each candidate who runs in the election on a state ballot will have a slate of electors that are bound to them. And so whenever you go and vote for someone, you vote for someone's name, but you're really voting for their slate of electors. And then whoever wins the popular vote in the state in 48 of our 50 states, that person's electors then get to go to the state capitol in December and then cast their vote for their candidate. All these certificates then are collected at each of the state capitals, are then transmitted to Congress. And then after the first of the year, we have a joint session of Congress where all the certificates are opened up and all the votes are tallied and the president is selected. Now, if no one gets a majority of the Electoral College votes, no one gets to the 270 vote majority, The election then goes into the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives then selects the president. The House of Representatives, in their selection of the president, each congressional delegation gets one vote. So regardless of the fact that California may have 53 members of the House and Montana has one, or Wyoming has one, each congressional delegation serves as one vote. So Wyoming and Montana have the same influence in the selection as a large state like California or Texas or New York. The House of Representatives then votes to select the president, and the US Senate then votes for selecting the vice president. Now, it has happened a few times in our history where no one has gotten a majority in the Electoral College. And perhaps the most famous example of that was the election of 1824. And if you remember the election of 1824 from your history classes, anybody remember the election of 1824, what came to be known as the corrupt bargain? Anybody familiar with that? And text Jack. If I remember the corrupt bargain of 1824, it's kind of a stretch, but in 1824, we had multiple candidates running for the presidency, and your top three candidates were John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, and Henry Clay. Because you had three main candidates, there were more, but you had three main candidates that were splitting the Electoral College vote. At the end of the election, no one had a majority in the Electoral College. Andrew Jackson had more popular votes than anybody else, and Andrew Jackson had more Electoral College votes than anybody else. He had a plurality in both the popular as well as the Electoral College vote, but he did not have a majority in the Electoral College. So according to the Constitution, the election then goes in the House of Representatives. But when it went into the House of Representatives, Henry Clay, who was in third place essentially, cut a deal with John Quincy Adams. And John Quincy Adams promised to make Henry Clay his Secretary of State if Henry Clay would convince his supporters to throw their support behind John Quincy Adams. So Henry Clay's supporters in Congress threw their support behind John Quincy Adams. The House of Representatives then elected John Quincy Adams as president. And lo and behold, once John Quincy Adams takes office, he then appoints Henry Clay as Secretary of State. Hence the reason why it came to be known as the corrupt bargain. Now, 4 years later, in 1828, Andrew Jackson had a rematch with John Quincy Adams and thoroughly trounced him in both the popular vote as well as the Electoral College vote, and won the presidency in his own right in 1828. We have had some instances, very few, but where no one gets a majority in the Electoral College, and so it goes to the House of Representatives to decide. What happens more frequently, and has happened relatively frequently in the past few years, has been when the result in the popular election doesn't match the result in the Electoral College. We saw that in 2016, where Hillary Clinton got more popular votes than Donald Trump, but Donald Trump ended up getting a majority in the Electoral College. We saw that in the year 2000 with Al Gore and George W. Bush. Al Gore won the popular vote relatively handily, but because of what happened in Florida, the electoral votes for Florida went to George Bush, which gave him a bare majority of 271 electoral votes, and that was good enough to make him president. So there's always that concern when the results of the popular vote don't match up with the results from the Electoral College. And that is why we have seen a movement among many states to try and reform the Electoral College, so that states are starting to pledge that they will have their electoral votes all go to the winner of the national popular vote. And so we have seen some states start to sign on to that type of movement. There aren't enough states right now to add up to 270 in the Electoral College that have agreed to that. But if it ever gets to that point in time, we may actually see a very substantive change to the Electoral College. Okay, I'll stop talking about the Electoral College now, but I just, it's the way in which we elect presidents. So I think it's an important thing for us all to understand. Presidents, when they take office, when they're inaugurated, there's actually an oath that they need to say word for word here in the Constitution. And you can see that oath there just before Section 2 of Article 2 of the Constitution. I only mention that because in Barack Obama's first term, when he was inaugurated, Chief Justice Roberts screwed up the oath at the inauguration and mixed up some of the words of the oath, and so did not say the oath in the exact way in which it's listed in the Constitution. John Roberts then insisted that he meet with Barack Obama the next day in the Oval Office and re-administer the oath exactly how it was written in the Constitution, because he felt that it was not constitutional because he did not recite the oath correctly. So we're very specific about that oath that presidents need to say. Section 2 talks a lot about the powers of the president. We know the president is commander-in-chief of the military. That was very important for the framers to have a civilian in charge of the military. We also know that the president has the ability to appoint for vacancies in the executive branch. He has appointment power. We also know that presidents have the ability to seek advice and counsel from those executive officials, thus making the president the chief executive. The president has the responsibility to take care that laws are faithfully executed, again, making the president the chief of the executive branch. The president in those appointments needs to get the confirmation from the Senate for some of those appointments, so works in tandem with the Senate in making those appointments. Also, the president can enter into treaties, but those treaties are then also subject to the advice and consent of the Senate as well. And so a lot of these powers that the president has, the president then shares that power with the legislative branch. But the president is basically commander-in-chief. The chief executive is chief of state through the signing these treaties, is oftentimes referred to as the chief legislator, because the second section of the second article also gives the president the ability to recommend legislation to Congress, which some political scientists will say makes him or her the chief legislator for the nation as well. The president is the chief diplomat for the nation, so all those are hats that the president wears. Last night, President Biden gave the State of the Union address, and that's a requirement here in Article 2, Section 3 of the Constitution, that from time to time give to the Congress information on the State of the Union. And we saw that last night. Obviously, presidents and vice presidents and other civil officers of the United States can be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. We argue a lot about what the framers meant by high crimes and misdemeanors. The framers really haven't given us a whole lot of good guidance in terms of what they mean by high crimes and misdemeanors. Some historians will argue that the framers really like the term misdemeanor. It comes from English law, and because they liked the term so much, they included that term here in Article 2 without a whole lot of consideration for what was actually meant by a misdemeanor. Misdemeanors under English law are different than misdemeanors that we have in our current criminal justice system. So whenever there is an impeachment discussion, we always have this argument about what really qualifies for impeaching a president and removing that president from office. Well, if Article 2 is shorter than Article 1, Article 3 is a lot shorter than both of them. And Article 3 speaks about the judicial branch, primarily speaks about the Supreme Court. The only court established in Article 3 is the U.S. Supreme Court. There are no requirements listed in the Constitution for being able to serve on the Supreme Court. There's no minimum age, there's no minimum residency requirement, there's no requirement to be a lawyer or to have passed the bar. None of those requirements exist in Article 3. Article 3 lays out a couple of different jurisdictions for the Supreme Court, what's called original and appellate jurisdiction. So under original jurisdiction, cases can get to the Supreme Court initially, so they can go directly to the Supreme Court. That would be something that has profound constitutional implications, something that must be decided immediately, can go directly to the U.S. Supreme Court. That's an expedited type of jurisdiction. Very few cases go to the Supreme Court under original jurisdiction. 99.99999% of cases go to the Supreme Court through appellate jurisdiction. They are appealed through the federal judiciary from district courts, appealed up to courts of appeal, and then appealed up to the Supreme Court. Vast majority go to the Supreme Court through appellate jurisdiction. But the overwhelming majority of cases are not heard by the Supreme Court. Supreme Court rejects hearing the vast majority of cases that come to it on appeal. It is indeed a rare case that actually gets accepted by the Supreme Court. And usually when the Supreme Court accepts a case, it's because of establishing a precedent, that the court wants to establish a precedent for some big constitutional federalism, separation of powers type of issue, or some big civil liberties or civil rights issue. Those are the cases that are usually granted what's called a writ by the court, and the court will then hear those cases. Again, not a whole lot of detail that the framers give us in Article 3 for the judicial branch. Article 4 contains a few different things. One thing in Article 4 is this thing called the full faith and credit provision, which means that each state must give full faith and credit to the laws of other states. They must respect the laws of other states. Any new states to join the union must be approved by Congress. And so a few years ago here in California, there was going to be a ballot initiative to break California up into 3 separate states. Well, that would be all well and good if California decides to break up into 3 separate states, but that would have to be approved by Congress, because Congress approves all new states. Congress approves all compacts and agreements between states. That's all the responsibility of Congress. And the United States in Section 4 guarantees to every state of the Union a Republican form of government, meaning that every state government must be a Republican form of government, not the party Republican, but Republic, as we talked about last week, whereby people elect representatives to go and make decisions for them. So that's a requirement for every state in the Union. Article 5 deals with how we amend the Constitution. Remember, one of the big flaws of the Articles of Confederation is that you need a unanimous agreement in order to amend the Articles, which just never happened. And here we actually lay out 4 different ways in which you can amend the Constitution. The first way you can amend the Constitution is an amendment proposed by 2/3 of the House and the Senate, and then ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures. That's the approach we have always used in amending the Constitution. We've only used approach number 1, proposal by 2/3 of the House and the Senate, ratification by 3/4 of state legislatures. But there's another approach, the second approach. Proposal by 2/3 of the House and the Senate, and then ratification by 3/4 of state constitutional conventions. So rather than having legislative bodies ratify the amendments, we have the amendments ratified in a state constitutional convention. The third approach is if 2/3 of the states petition Congress for a national constitutional convention. Any amendments that come out of that national constitutional convention would then have to be ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures, or in approach number 4, any of those amendments that come out of that national constitutional convention would then have to be ratified by 3/4 of state constitutional conventions. Now, we are very concerned about constitutional conventions because constitutional conventions can end up becoming runaway conventions. We saw what happened to the Constitutional Convention when we were amending the articles. We ended up throwing out the articles and replacing them with a brand new constitution. Who's to say that's not going to happen again if we have another constitutional convention? So to be on the safe side, we always use that first approach, proposed by 2/3 of the House and the Senate, and then ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures. It's just a safer way of amending the Constitution. One of the major parts of Article 6 is the supremacy clause, that the Constitution, the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land. So whenever a state constitution or state law comes into conflict with the national constitution or national law, the national constitution or national law win. That's a very strong pronouncement of national government power. And this is something that really concerned anti-federalists, because they felt that with this supremacy clause, this national government would be able to really run roughshod over states, and that state laws and constitutions would always lose out to the national constitution. So this was something that a lot of those anti-federalists and citizens in New York were very, very concerned about and didn't want to end up ratifying the Constitution. Article 7 then says how we ratify the Constitution. You need to have 9 states to ratify the Constitution for the Constitution to go into effect. As we had said last week, we had 10 states ratify the Constitution relatively quickly within 2 years. but we didn't have the state of New York. The state of New York was dragging its feet and was very concerned about the strength of the new national government. And in order to get the state of New York to ratify the Constitution, which we needed the state of New York to ratify the Constitution, we had initially 10 brand new amendments added to the Constitution immediately in the Bill of Rights. And then we had the Federalist Papers that were written by Hamilton, Jay, and Madison. So let's talk about the Bill of Rights very quickly, and then we'll talk about the other amendments to the Constitution. And then we'll make mention to Federalist Paper number 39 and the Madisonian argument for why this Constitution was something that needed to be ratified and nothing for the anti-federalists to be afraid of. So we initially amend the Constitution 10 times with the Bill of Rights, guaranteeing certain civil liberties and certain freedoms to individuals as well as to states. So we're all familiar with the First Amendment to the Constitution, which was ratified in 1791. Congress shall make no law respecting establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. For freedom of religion, there are two parts. There's the Establishment Clause and there's the Free Exercise Clause. In terms of the Establishment Clause, Congress shall make no law respecting establishment of religion, which means that there cannot be a national religion. Congress cannot tell you, the national government cannot tell you what to believe. Your ability to believe what you want to believe is unfettered, and you have the ability to believe anything that you want to believe. But then it comes to free exercise of that religious belief. Over the years, the Supreme Court has tolerated certain limited restrictions on the free exercise, the free practice of religion. If the way in which you exercise your religion causes concern or can place the public in harm's way, or it could erode the rights of another individual, there can be some limitations placed upon the exercise of religion. So if a religion calls for sacrificing animals, you obviously can't go out in the middle of the street and sacrifice an animal because there are public safety implications for that type of a practice. Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech. We do know the Supreme Court has tolerated some limitations on that right as well. You cannot yell fire in a crowded theater because, again, implications for public safety. You have the right to peaceably assemble, but we also know that Supreme Court tolerates some limitations on that when it comes to public safety. You have to get usually a permit before you can go out there and peaceably protest and peaceably assemble, again, for public safety types of reasons. And freedom of press. Again, we want to have a free press because the press serves as a watchdog on government and what government officials are doing. But again, there are some limitations there. And some of the limitations are things like libel laws that do exist for false reporting that could injure someone else. Those libel laws usually apply to private citizens and they don't apply to public figures. Second Amendment, this is the very contentious one that we argue about all the time. It's always in the news. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. It's interesting that that first clause, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, sometimes that's overlooked. And sometimes gun advocacy groups will completely ignore the well-regulated militia part of the Second Amendment. So the question is, was that there for a reason? And sometimes we argue about what the framers meant by what they wrote. But if we really want to know what the framers meant by what they wrote in the Constitution, we can look at things like the Federalist Papers. And we don't have time to really get into it now. But if you are interested in what Alexander Hamilton meant by a well-regulated militia, I would tell you to go and take a look at two Federalist Papers, Federalist Paper number 46 and Federalist Paper number 29. I'll put those numbers in our text chat, 46 and 29. And in Federalist Paper 46 and 29, Hamilton devotes a great bit of the discussion to what he means by a well-regulated militia and argues that in order to be a well-regulated militia, we would have to have meetings maybe once or twice a year where the militias can organize themselves, they can see what types of weaponry they have and make sure they have the appropriate weaponry to then secure the people against any intrusions from a national government. And so if you're interested in that, read 46 and 29, and you'll really be able to see what Hamilton had to say when he was talking about well-regulated militias. The Third Amendment is one we don't talk about a lot. No quartering of soldiers. It speaks to the right of privacy of your home, that you can't be forced to allow soldiers to stay in your home. The Fourth Amendment also is a privacy one, unwarrantable search and seizure, that you have to have a search warrant before you can go and search someone's belongings or someone's property, again, for privacy rights. Fifth Amendment gives you your criminal justice protections. And so, for instance, you have the ability to not be tried twice for the same crime. That's what's called double jeopardy. And so you're protected from double jeopardy. You're also protected from having to be a witness against yourself, protected against self-incrimination. You also are protected from having your property taken away from public use without just compensation. And you cannot have your life, liberty, or property taken away without due process of law. You need to have a trial. You need to have some due process of law before your life, liberty, or your property can be taken. Now, an important point to emphasize here is that early on, and by early on, we're talking throughout the 1800s and somewhat into the 1900s, the courts oftentimes didn't view these protections as protections against state government actions as well. They interpret these protections to be protections against the federal government. And I know we're running long here, but in terms of double jeopardy, there's a really interesting example with someone by the name of Palco. And this gentleman by the name of Mr. Palco was tried for murder in the state of Connecticut. He was found not guilty by a jury. The state of Connecticut didn't like that he was found not guilty, and so they retried him. Same exact case, same exact details and facts of the case. The second time he was tried, he was found guilty. He complained and said, that's a violation of my protections against double jeopardy. That's double jeopardy. I was tried for the same crime twice. In 1937, his case went to the Supreme Court in Palco versus Connecticut, and the Supreme Court said, we're sorry, Mr. Palco, but these double jeopardy protections in the Fifth Amendment only apply to actions by the federal government. They do not apply to actions taken by the state of Connecticut. It was not until 30 years later, in a follow-up case called Benton versus Maryland, that the Supreme Court finally agreed and said, yes, double jeopardy protections include protection against being tried for the same crime twice by state governments as well as by the national government. That process of applying these rights to include protections against state government action, that's a process that is known in federalism as incorporation. Put that in text chat, incorporation. So whenever the courts incorporate, and whenever they incorporate rights, it means that they are including protections against state government action as well as protections against the national government. But that was a long and gradual process to get to incorporation. The Sixth Amendment, again, criminal justice protections. You have the right to a speedy trial, and sometimes trials are not quite as speedy as we would like for them to be. You have the right to confront witnesses on your behalf in your trial. Seventh Amendment, you have a right to a jury trial in civil cases that are worth more than $20. Again, this kind of dates the Constitution. $20 meant a whole lot in 1791. Doesn't mean quite as much today, but you do have that right. Eighth Amendment, right against cruel and unusual punishment. Excessive bail shall not be required, no excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. Again, we oftentimes argue about this in terms of the death penalty. And the Gregg versus Georgia case is a great example of the Supreme Court allowing for certain types of capital punishment in states. The Ninth Amendment says that the enumeration of the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. So in other words, just because we are listing these rights and these powers for the national government, it doesn't mean that we are taking rights away from the people. That again, this is a social contract whereby the people retain their rights. 10th Amendment is known as the Reserve Powers Amendment. Again, this was done along with the 9th Amendment primarily for the benefit of the anti-federalists and citizens of New York. Powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. That if a right is not given in the Constitution to Congress or to the United States, then that right belongs to the state or to individual citizens. Now, this is in direct contrast to things like the elastic clause in Article 1, Section 8. It stands in direct contrast to the supremacy clause in the Sixth Amendment to the Sixth Article to the Constitution. And this is where we have that dynamic nature in terms of federalism and who has the responsibility and who has the power in our federal system. Constitution is a series of compromises. And whenever you have compromises, you're going to have those inherent conflicts. And just to quickly go through the other amendments, then in 1795, we had the 11th Amendment, which limited the judicial power of the federal government. The federal government didn't have judicial power in cases brought by citizens of a state against another state. The 12th Amendment, directly from Thomas Jefferson, which would mean that under the original Constitution, the person who came in first became president, the person who came in second became vice president. Obviously, that meant you had a president and a vice president. They were oftentimes from different parties. We had that with Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, his vice president. Thomas Jefferson hated Aaron Burr, and so was able to get Congress to propose this 12th Amendment, whereby essentially presidents and vice presidents run together, so you will not have a president and vice president from opposite parties. 13th Amendment abolished slavery in 1865. 14th Amendment is the Equal Protection Amendment. And the 14th Amendment, we say a lot of things, but one thing we essentially say is we try and incorporate some of these rights to include protections against state governments as well. So states shall not deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So we're not only saying the national government can't do it, we're saying state governments cannot do it either. One part of the 14th Amendment that really was discussed a lot in the end of the last administration was this provision for people who support insurrections, people who support rebellion, being disqualified from holding public office. And we saw some members of Congress argue that some of their colleagues should not be able to serve in Congress because they supported January 6th. And it became for lack of a better term, a whole thing in Congress during the last session. 15th Amendment says that you cannot deny someone the right to vote based upon race, color, or previous condition of servitude. 16th Amendment gave us our direct federal income tax. 17th Amendment made senators popularly elected, so no longer selected by state legislatures. 18th Amendment was prohibition. 19th Amendment was women's suffrage. 20th Amendment changed the terms of the president and Congress to move them from beginning in March to beginning in January, so you didn't have so much intervening time between the election in November and when people would take office. 21st Amendment repealed the 18th Amendment, repealed prohibition. 22nd Amendment gave us a 2-term limit for presidents, again, as response to FDR in the 4 terms that he had been elected to as president. 23rd Amendment gives us those 3 electoral college votes for the District of Columbia. 24th Amendment barred poll taxes, which are being used along with Jim Crow laws in the South to disenfranchise people and keep people from voting. So poll taxes are no longer allowed. 25th Amendment talks about presidential disability and succession. So what happens whenever a president is unable to serve their term? We have some provisions here whereby the vice president can get together with a majority of the cabinet and can declare a presidential disability, and the vice president could then take over as the president. Also, a committee established by Congress could also do the same type of thing. And so these are ways in which a president who's no longer able to serve can then be removed from office. 26th Amendment gives the right to vote to 18, 19, and 20-year-olds. And then our most recent amendment, ratified in 1992, no law varying the compensation for the services of senators and representatives shall take effect until an election shall be intervened. This was an original amendment that was proposed as part of the Bill of Rights way back in 1790 by our good friend James Madison. It never got the requisite states to ratify it, to become part of the Constitution, to become part of the Bill of Rights. And so it then went dormant, and it went dormant for 200 years. In the 1970s, a student in Texas made an argument in a paper saying that this amendment was still viable because it didn't have a sunset provision. Now, a lot of amendments have sunset provisions, which means that they'll say, if this is not ratified by at least 3/4 of state legislatures or conventions within 7 years, it becomes inoperable. It goes out of existence. Well, back then, Madison did not put that sunset provision in. The student argued it was still a viable amendment, started an entire nationwide movement to get enough states to ratify it to make it part of the Constitution. And on May 7th, 1992, was able to get 3/4 of state legislatures to ratify it. And it then became the 27th Amendment to the Constitution, originally authored by James Madison, and 200 years later became the final amendment to the federal Constitution. So kind of an interesting case of our last amendment. So then, a very large nutshell is the Constitution. It's 7 articles and it's 27 amendments. Now, again, we had to put a lot of compromises in the Constitution in order to get the Anti-Federalists and the citizens in New York to sign off on that Constitution. The Federalist Papers, all 85 of them, were written for the purpose of getting the citizens of New York to ratify the Constitution. One of the other Federalist Papers, in addition to number 10 that you read, was Federalist Paper number 39. And in Federalist Paper number 39, James Madison makes an interesting argument whereby he deconstructs this Constitution into its component elements to show that this new Constitution is really a combination of a national and a federal approach. For Madison, a national approach would be an approach whereby the national government has most of the power. For Madison, a federal approach would be an approach in which the state governments retain most of the power. So he wanted to reassure the citizens of New York and the Anti-Federalists that this was just not solely a national document, it was both a national as well as a federal document, and that state governments would retain power and sovereignty and authority. So essentially what he did is he did 2 things. One thing he did in Federalist Paper number 39 is he showed them this Constitution is not unlike what you already have in your respective state constitutions. So for instance, the president serves 4 years in office. Most governors have 4-year terms as well. Members of the House serve 2-year terms. That's shorter than most of the terms that are being served by members of your state legislatures. Even the Senate, which serves a long 6-year term, in some of the states, your representatives serve more than 6 years. They serve 7 years or they serve 8 years. So he made the argument, this Constitution looks and feels a lot like the state constitutions you already adopted. So it's nothing for you to be afraid of. But then the second thing he did is he pulled the Constitution apart into its component elements to see whether or not those component elements were national or federal in nature. So he says, well, let's look at the origin of the Constitution and the basis of power. Well, the Constitution, this new nation, was put together by the states. The states ratified this new Constitution. The delegates at the Constitutional Convention were all representatives of their states. So therefore, the states created the Constitution, the states created the Union. So it's very federal in that type of perspective. It says, let's look at the extent of power and the power of the president, the power of Congress. When you look at the power of the president, you've got the Electoral College, and the Electoral College is heavily controlled by states. And so the states have a very federal approach in selecting the president. You look at the Congress, well, yes, we have a national approach in terms of proportional representation and direct election of the House, but members of the Senate and the original Constitution were selected by state legislatures. That's very federal in nature. So in terms of the extent of power, it's a combination of a national and a federal approach. It says, well, let's look at the operation of government. Okay, in this one, he throws his hands up and says, okay, I give up. In terms of operation of the government, the operation of the national government will be by individual citizens, individual bureaucrats. So it's very national in nature. I'll give you that one. The operation of the government will be national in nature. But how do we amend the Constitution? Well, we amend the Constitution. It's a very federal way in which we amend the Constitution, in that you have to have 3/4 of states agreeing either through a legislature or through a constitutional convention in order to amend the Constitution. So the way we amend it is national and federal. And you kind of get the idea. He pulls the whole Constitution apart and shows how each different part of the Constitution is really a combination of a national and a federal approach to reassure people that state governments would retain their power and they would retain their authority. Certainly in the late 1700s, if you would travel overseas and you would go to Europe and someone asked, where are you from? You probably would say, I'm a Virginian, or I'm a Pennsylvanian, or I'm a New Yorker. You would really attach yourself to your state more so than saying, I'm an American, or I'm from the United States of America. But the loyalties of people would really still reside with their states. And that was the argument Madison made in order to allay those concerns of the anti-federalists and the citizens of New York. And obviously the combination of the Bill of Rights along with those Federalist Papers was successful at getting the citizens of New York to ratify the Constitution. All 13 states then fell in line, the Constitution was ratified, and it is a social contract that we have today between government and the people. So that kind of wraps up our discussion of the foundations of American government and the Constitution. Again, we spent time on the Constitution because we as public administrators need to know the Constitution and know what types of rights are provided to citizens within that Constitution. But I know we're running very long. We only have about 15 minutes or so left. And I would be remiss if I didn't at least give you the information you need to then do Canvas essay number 2. So we certainly don't have time to do accountability and ethics and move into a new topic. But what we do have time to do is to allow me to show you the ASPA, American Society for Public Administration Code of Ethics, and the 8 principles in that code of ethics that you will be using then to do Canvas essay number 2 for next week. So we're going to do a major shift of gears here. And let me show you this ASPA Code of Conduct. You should be able to see it on your screen now. And the American Society for Public Administration is an organization that advances the science, art, and practice of public administration. Society affirms its responsibility to develop the spirit of responsible professionalism within its membership and to increase awareness and commitment to ethical principles and standards among all those who work in public service in all sectors. The American Society for Public Administration is the professional organization that we all share as public administrators. Now, depending upon your career track, depending upon your profession, there'll probably be other professional organizations that you also belong to. If you're an engineer, I'm sure you have a society of engineering that you belong to. Budget analysts will have a professional organization they belong to. Psychologists have a professional organization that they belong to. But the one code of conduct that kind of binds us all together as public administrators is this one that comes from the American Society for Public Administration. So the ASPA Code of Conduct is predicated upon 8 different principles. And let's walk through them now, and then I'll tell you again what you're going to be doing for Canvas essay number 2. So the first principle is to advance the public interest, to promote the interests of the public and put service to the public above service to oneself. So obviously we all are rational self-interest actors, but our private interests, interests must always be subordinate to the public interest. Second principle is upholding the Constitution, the law. This is why we went through this protracted discussion of the Constitution. Respect and support government constitutions and laws while seeking to improve laws and policies to promote the public good. Number 3, to promote democratic participation. Inform the public and encourage active engagement in governance. Be open, transparent, and responsive, and respect and assist all persons in their dealings with public organizations. Number 4, to strengthen social equity. Treat all persons with fairness, justice, and equality, and respect individual differences, rights, and freedoms. Promote affirmative action and other initiatives to reduce unfairness, injustice, and inequality in society. Number 5, to fully inform and advise. Provide accurate, honest, comprehensive, and timely information and advice to elected and appointed officials and governing board members and to staff members in your organization. Next week, as we talk more about accountability and ethics in public administration, we'll talk about things like the principal-agent relationship, and we'll talk about some of the reasons why it can be somewhat difficult for us to fully inform and advise those who are overseeing our action. Number 6, demonstrate personal integrity. Adhere to the highest standards of conduct to inspire public confidence and trust in public service. Number 7, to promote ethical organizations. Strive to attain the highest standards of ethics, stewardship, and public service in organizations that serve the public. And number 8, advance professional excellence. Strengthen personal capabilities to act competently and ethically, and encourage the professional development of others. So those are the 8 main principles in the ASPA Code of Conduct. For your second Canvas essay, what you'll be doing is selecting 3 of those 8 principles that you think would be most difficult for you to implement as an individual and or in your organization, and tell me why those 3 would be more difficult than the other principles within the Code of Conduct. So I think it's important, again, it's kind of weird for us to spend all this time on the Constitution and then quickly shift gears in the Code of Conduct, but I just wanted to expose you to the Code of Conduct because that's what you're going to be using for your Canvas essay for next week. The next week, when we get into our discussion of accountability and ethics in the first half of class, we will talk about some of the reasons why it's difficult to hold public administrators accountable. We'll talk about some of the different ways in which we measure accountability. We'll talk about the balance that we must maintain between external controls and the freedom of public administrators to be creative and to be able to do their job to the best of their ability. We'll talk about differences between ethics in the public sector versus the private sector, and really give you a good introduction to ethics and accountability within the field of public administration. I just want you to be able to see these 8 principles to then prepare you for that Canvas essay that you need to turn in for next week. But that being said, since we do have a few minutes left at the end here, let's go back and to what we talked about with the Constitution and the foundations of American government. Does anyone have any questions about those foundational principles of American government that we talked about last week as well as this week, or any questions about our coverage of the Constitution that we've done tonight? Any questions on any of that material? Because this will pretty much wrap up that primer, that tutorial on American government, and beginning next week, we'll then move into some of the specific elements of the discipline of public administration. So the first half of class, accountability and ethics in the public sector. And then the second half of class next week, we'll get into a discussion of some of the main differences between the public sector and the private sector, and just how different or how similar the study of the public sector is as compared to what we do here in our study of public administration. And that will then all lay the groundwork then for the following week for us to move into a discussion of the discipline of public administration and talk about what we do in studying the discipline of public administration, and then to have a robust discussion, hopefully, about whether or not public administration truly is a discipline, why or why not. Because I think what you really need to take away from you in this class, when you leave this class after 8 weeks, is a good, thorough understanding of what you are studying in an MPA program and why you are studying public administration to begin with. So any questions on any of this information from tonight? Okay. If not, then I'll give you back a few minutes tonight since I held you late last time. The next week, we'll get back together and we'll talk about accountability and ethics and public and private sector differences. I look forward to reading your Canvas essay number 2, and I hope you have a good remainder of your week, and I'll talk to you again then next Wednesday. So take care, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.